Good evening. I am pleased to be up here. I'm pleased to be worshiping with you all today. I'm very thankful for this opportunity. Hopefully for the next few minutes, we'll look at the Word of God. We will draw some lessons from it, and then we will depart for the rest of our weeks. So, in May of 1940, less than a year into World War II, the British forces found themselves in peril. The German forces had just invaded France, where they were, and this invasion drove the British and French forces to this beach at the port of Dunkirk. If infiltrated and captured, the entirety of the trained British soldiers would be gone. And they'd have to do a fresh start, and that would likely mean sure defeat for the army. What followed is a rescue mission unlike anything else ever seen. Ordered by Winston Churchill and facilitated by Admiral Bertram Ramsay, Operation Dynamo, as it was called, was started, and it was a massive evacuation from this port across the English Channel. They used both the naval ships and civilian ships because the port was so shallow that the naval ships couldn't reach. So there was a massive duality of both of these ships and boats going across the English Channel to allow these soldiers to evacuate. Over the course of a week, 338,000 soldiers were evacuated thanks to this coalition. And what initially seemed like this dire retreat at this moment actually became a national morale booster. The evacuation spurred a newfound determination for fighting in this war, and was actually seen as a positive thing, even though the evacuation had to take place. So there's a story that we read about in the Bible that has some comparisons to this event. It's a story where an entire group of people could have been completely annihilated and would have meant the end of their entire group. They could have fallen into the hands of the enemy, but instead they overcame the odds thanks to the brave actions of two people in particular. And this story is found in the book of Esther. And so tonight, what I wanted to do is look at that story and look at it from the perspective of the other main character. There's Esther, obviously, but then the other character is Mordecai. So when I was presented with the opportunity to preach tonight, I just kept coming back, going through ideas and topics. I kept coming back to Mordecai. He's one of my favorite Bible characters, along with Esther. And I wanted to look at him as an example, as a sort of model for faithfulness, for wisdom, for perseverance, joy in the Lord, and look at the story of Esther through Mordecai's eyes. This quote I have up here, it's from Esther 5:15-17. The light and gladness and joy and honor. We'll see what that's all about at the end. But before that, I figured that we could do just a brief review of Esther and see what the overall story is, and then pull out some lessons from Mordecai's place in all of that. So, Esther is a pretty cool book. It's the only book in the Bible not to mention God by name. There are two books named after women, the other one being Ruth. There are two books set entirely outside of the Promised Land, the other being Daniel. But as opposed to Esther, Daniel actually focuses on this concept. In Daniel's prayers, we see the fact that he's not in the Promised Land come up, whereas it's not mentioned here. It contains the single longest English verse in the Bible when translated to English. It's the longest Bible verse, Esther 8, verse 9. And then, most importantly, it has a very unique narrative structure. It's a very excellently told story. You can compare it to how we have like historical documentary series, like dramatic series today, in that it's a true story that's happening, but the writer decides to draw out particular moments and emphasize particular points to make the characters more lively, and certain explorations for us as the readers to gravitate towards. And we'll get into that. Esther is it's a very good story. It has everything you kind of want in a good story. There's suspense, there's even comedy, and then, like I mentioned, the compelling characters. So the first character, there's four main characters. So the first one that we're going to look at tonight, obviously, is Mordecai. Mordecai is the cousin of Esther and the guardian of Esther. Esther is an orphan, and Mordecai has taken her in. He's a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin, and he's an important figure in this Persian Empire, both religiously for the Jewish people and politically. He's a part of the king's workers of sorts. He's not yet an advisor to the king, but he does work near to the king's facilities and throne. Esther, obviously, she's the cousin of Mordecai. She's also a Jew, and we're told she is physically beautiful. She's very loyal to Mordecai. She's wise, and she is very faithful to her people. All very admirable traits for both of these. Now, not so admirably, we have the other two main characters. We have Ahasuerus, who is the Persian king. He's the ruler of all of these provinces in the Persian Empire. He craves wine and authority, and he's often portrayed as very clueless and very immature. He often needs others to make decisions for him. And then the last character is Haman. He's not at the beginning in the introductory part, but once our story gets started, Haman is the number two man to the king. He is a close advisor. We're told he's an Agagite, and if you look back at the history of the Agagites, those people have contention with the people of Israel. And then he's often driven by a craving for honor, for power, and he's very selfish and very short-tempered. So, to run through a brief timeline of the book of Esther, in chapter 1 and 2, we have Queen Vashti. She is revoked of her title because she refuses to attend one of King Ahasuerus' parties. He likely just wanted to show her off as like an object and just have people look at her while they had these parties and had wine and everything. So she is taken down as queen. And so there's this massive contest to look for the next queen. And after a lot of like vetting and processes, Esther eventually is selected by the king. And a big part of that is probably because of her physical beauty, because King Ahasuerus is very superficial. And so that's his original choice for selecting her. But she becomes queen, Esther becomes the queen, and we see Mordecai, while Esther is going through this process, he's outside the gates of the king's palace, and he overhears two men talking about a plot to assassinate the king. He then has that reported, and those two men are killed, and those things are documented in the Persian chronicles, like the history-taking writings. But the king does not yet know what Mordecai did. So then into chapter 3, we read about Haman being outraged because as he is going through the town, Mordecai refuses to bow to Haman, and that kicks off his quick temper. Haman finds out that Mordecai is a Jew, and because of that, he decides to make a whole decree for all the Jews in the Persian Empire to be destroyed. And the thing about Persian law is it cannot be revoked. So once the decree goes out, it's on a certain month, on a certain day, that is set in stone. It can't be revoked from there. So as we move on from that, Mordecai goes into a deep sorrow because his people are going to be destroyed. And him and Esther start communicating through messengers back and forth, working out this plan to try to use Esther's new position as queen to make a request to the king to both take care of Haman and to save her people. This is one of the most prominent portions of Esther, in that Esther went into the king's throne room without being requested. That could lead to death if the king does not raise the scepter. He did for Esther, and so in risking her own peril, she ended up getting to make those requests for the king. And then in chapter 6, we find that King Ahasuerus is made aware by Esther of how Mordecai and her are connected, and in finding that out, he also reads from the Chronicles the writings of when he spoiled the plot of the two men that wanted to assassinate the king, and celebrates him and has him celebrated for doing that in honor of the kingdom. And then in learning what Haman did to them, the king decides to have him killed in with the same gallows that were set up for Mordecai by Haman. So Mordecai takes Haman's place, and they have him out of the picture, but there's still the biggest risk of having their people destroyed with this decree that Haman made still standing. So moving into chapter 8, Mordecai and Esther bring forth these concerns to the king, and because Persian law can't be overruled, the king allows Mordecai, with his newfound second man position, to make a decree that not reverses, but is like counter to the original decree, in that the Jews can defend themselves, effectively eliminating the idea that people can just go in and kill all of these Jewish people. So because of that, when the day and time comes, the Jews are able to fight back. They overcome their enemies, and they achieve victory, which leads to a giant celebration, a holiday, and a feast called Purim being established and celebrated from then on out. And then all of that wraps up into the last chapter, just 3 verses long, saying that Mordecai is very famous among his people, and he's known for speaking peace and for speaking like joy and peace to all his people. So that's the brief overview here. So now let's look into some specifics of Mordecai's role in all of this that allows us to have lessons that we can draw from it. The first of which is that faith is essential. In Esther 2, verse 21 through 23, that's just the passage that talks about Mordecai spoiling that plot as his duty to the throne. Even though he's a Jewish man, even though this crown that he's dutiful towards is going to be the same crown that has the power and the authority and does decree to destroy his people, he's still dutiful to that. He still fulfills what he should do, what is right. And that's because of his faith. And it goes on to, throughout the book of Esther, to show that God's providence is evident throughout the whole book. A lot of the exploration of the narrative that the author gives as we go through the story points towards that. Why certain things are happening, it's not directly explained, and it makes us as the readers search to see why that is. And with that evident providence, we're also let in on the concept that faithfulness is not immediately rewarded. Mordecai does what is right, and it's recorded, thankfully, but he doesn't get anything out of that right in that moment. It's just what he's supposed to do, and his life continues from there. If faith is absent from this picture, none of this happens. None of the events that take place in this story happen without faith, and their faith guiding them to do what is right. For us, that's a very significant idea, that faithfulness is what matters. It's not the individual outcomes. I have two verses here that we'll read in a second. You can equate this to, if you want to think about military leaders and soldiers in the military, they're all going towards this common goal. And a large part of actual combat in a battle is that they're all on the same page. They're all doing what needs to be done, and that takes immense bravery, immense courage. And with going into a battle, there is a sort of mindset taken on that it's not about the individual person's outcomes. You're going into that knowing that your side has to win that battle. And that's one of the ideas that's paralleled here. Our faithfulness here might not be rewarded in the current moment or on our time, and it might not even be in this life, but it will be rewarded. And as Jacob mentioned, a lot of those ideas will pop up later. The deliverance is so much greater for what we have. They have physical deliverance from this enemy overcoming this destruction of their people, but our deliverance is an even greater one, a spiritual one. For these verses, to bring this point out, from Hebrews, and as Kyle was talking about, or Jonathan was talking about, the Hall of Faith, Hebrews 11 chapter that we talk about of all these characters. This is one of the most popular verses from that. And without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. And then James 1, 2 through 4, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. This testing of our faith idea plays into the same thing that Mordecai was dealing with, the remaining faithful despite all these points of suffering, of being sorrowful for his people, caring about his people. That's an extreme testing of his faith, and how we see him end up by the end of the story shows that he had that steadfastness that was built off that faith. So the next point that we can take from Mordecai's perspective is that godly wisdom effectively challenges evil. We have these two characters of Esther and Mordecai, essentially going against Haman primarily. King Ahasuerus has a lot to do with the evil that comes about in this story as well. For this point, I'm taking it from Esther 4, 13 and 14. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself, and this is the part where Mordecai and Esther are using messengers to communicate to each other. So Mordecai is delivering this message to Esther, who's inside the palace. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So First of all, we can see characteristics here of Mordecai's leadership capabilities, his trust in God. Mordecai knows that God will keep his promises. He knows that the Jews will be God's people. That's where he's talking about it might not be this that allows us to keep persevering. He knows it will happen, but he also knows that he assumes that Esther could be a part of that plan, of that deliverance, because she has the position that she does, being the queen to the Ahasuerus, to the throne. She could be a tool and an instrument to that, and that's what he's trying to describe to her as she, as they're trying to communicate what to do about the decree. So with that, it's the idea that we won't always know how God is interceding in our lives. We won't always know how, very like in practical steps, how our faithfulness will lead us into certain positions in life and out of certain positions in life. But we do know that we can trust and use all pieces of godly wisdom for that purpose. In James 1, 5, and 6, it says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. We all know that we should seek and should strive for that godly wisdom. And this is just a furthering of that point for us today. One of the coolest themes in Esther to me is the overlap that you see between human responsibility that God has provided for them to take advantage of and the divine sovereignty of God's plans coming together no matter the circumstances, merging together in this story. This is a physical and spiritual battle against evil here, and we see those two come together very clearly throughout this story. From James 3, 17 and 18. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Striving for that peace that is found in righteousness is how we can sow peace among others. So the last point here from Mordecai's perspective in this story is how he shared love and peace that came from God with others for his people. From Esther 10 and verse 3, this is the final verse in the book. For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. So Mordecai was using his position as the second in rank, obviously to deliver his people. But then from there, he was aware that the job wasn't done. It was equally, obviously Esther's role in this was very significant, but both of them worked together to deliver his people from certain destruction. And that recognition that just because the deliverance is there is not the end is also very familiar to us. In Galatians 5, verse 13, for you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. It translates directly to this New Testament idea that we are freed through Christ, and that then should persuade us to then further the cause that brought us that freedom to others. And that's, another theme throughout the Bible, through the New Testament, is that love, the service of others. It can provide that freedom for others. And then 1 Corinthians 13:13. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. So obviously Esther and Mordecai had these significant roles in allowing this deliverance to take place. But it's obvious that none of this is possible without God's unseen involvement through this story. And that can be the case with us as well. And he who searches hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. The Spirit is still interceding for us today. That pursuit of God that we continually embark on, the Spirit is there with us, guiding us to do the will of God. So, what are some final lessons that we can take from Mordecai's perspective in all of this? This graph here, this is a flow chart of sorts of how the story of Esther takes place. You see Mordecai and Esther maintaining their faith in this secular Persian world. They're still remaining faithful Jews. You see God provides this unseen guidance, and he's keeping his promises through the deliverance of the Jews. You see God deliver these people from destruction, and then God's people rejoice and praise him as a result of that, because of the blessings that he has provided from that deliverance. This same flow is obviously familiar because it's the New Testament message as well. It's the same type of flow that the New Testament talks about. So from Mordecai's example here, using this flow in mind of how that story of Esther compares to the same flow from God that comes down, here are some lessons that we can learn from that. So doing good is a natural product of our faith. Just because of that faith, that should guide us to do what is right and what is good. Godly wisdom provides the tools necessary to challenge evil. We mentioned verses that talked about that. We know that we can't go wrong if our wisdom is from God. Those are the tools that we can use and know that we can challenge evil with them. God brings spiritual peace to those that pursue him through that deliverance. In that pursuit, our roles as Christians actively, practically in the world will differ, but we are working towards a common purpose in him. Some of those roles will be more well-known to the public. Some of those will be more private. All of the work and the results of our faith are working towards that goal, and we see that in this story. And then lastly, when we pause to reflect on what God has done in our own lives, peace and truth should then characterize our speech, because that is how we can then share his influence with others. This is the passage that I opened with, and we'll read that now. This is immediately following the deliverance of the Jews. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. So this passage and that phrase underlined, this is the culmination of where God's deliverance has led these people. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. We have these spiritual blessings awaiting us as well. We read in Colossians, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work, and increasing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. We're offered these blessings that come from the peace of God. If we pursue him, that's what we can obtain. So let's seek to share with each other in this light, in this gladness, and joy, and honor. Our theme this year is aiming higher. aim higher to achieve these things through the pursuit of God. So that's all I have for you all tonight. If you are here and you are not partaking in these blessings yet, you can do that tonight. You can decide to come out of that domain of darkness, to achieve that inheritance, get those spiritual blessings, and then from there, you're on a continual walk for the remainder of your life here to continue to pursue these things. If you have made that decision and you are pursuing these things, but your journey and your inheritance has not given you the proper mindset, the proper actions, whatever it might be to continue that pursuit, and you need the help and the prayers of this congregation, you can also come forward now. So at this time, if you have any needs, please come forward while we stand and sing.